Hello, and welcome to episode 1 of Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon. This is the true beginning of my Fire Emblem Marathon series, being the first episode of the first game that I'm playing through. Exciting stuff, right? Let's jump right into a new game. I'll be playing on normal difficulty for two reasons. The first is that I want to show as much of the story as possible, and you miss the entire opening prologue if you choose to play on hard. The second is that I want the Marathon series to have an increasing difficulty curve, as I need to explain less and less about the mechanics and can focus more on the game. But since this is the very beginning, we'll start out at the baseline with normal, and turn off tutorials since I'm explaining how to play it myself. Once I get a chance to open the options menu, I'll speed up this text so conversations won't take as long. I do like how it pauses a little bit after the end of each sentence or at other places, because that's how people would talk in real life. Okay, first things first, let's go over the main menu. To open this up, you select a space that's not occupied by a unit, and it gives you some miscellaneous controls. Units lets you see a list of all the characters in your current team, gives you a quick overview of their stats, and you can sort it into any category along this top row. You can get crazy specific with this, like sorting it by who has the lowest to the highest luck, or who has the highest accuracy. Obviously right now, since we only have Marth, it doesn't matter all that much, and in general I don't use it very much myself, but it's there. Guide shows all the tutorial windows if you need a reminder. They appear on the top screen, and you can just dismiss them when you don't need them anymore. Some of these would pop up automatically if I had enabled tutorials. Oh. Here's the options menu. Lots of stuff in here, but I'm just going to quickly change the settings that are important to me. I like bumping up the brightness a couple notches. I think it just makes the game nicer to look at. Suspend lets you make a temporary save for the game, so you can take a break in the middle of a chapter and come back later. Once you load a suspend save though, the data is deleted, so it's not like actually making a save file, because that would kind of go against the tradition of Fire Emblem where when characters get killed in this game, if you didn't already know, they don't come back. So yeah, permanent death. So long story short, suspend is for when you need to temporarily close the game, but you can't actually use it to fix or go back on some of your screw-ups. And end lets you end your turn, even if you still have units that haven't done anything yet. Alright, let's get down to business. On the top screen, or the left screen from your perspective, right now we can see the stats of the unit we last scrolled over with the cursor, which is Marth, our main character. All these numbers and words are his stats and such. It looks intimidating at first glance, but I promise it's a lot less complicated than it looks. Most of these things here have to do with his abilities in combat, but since we're just taking a nice stroll to go talk to our sister, the only stat that matters to us right now is movement, or MOV. Each type of character, or class, has a different movement stat. As a Lord, Marth's movement is 7, which means he can move 7 tiles on the map in one turn. I can test that by selecting Marth and counting how far I can move him within the blue area. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. The red tiles represent places he can't move to, but if there was an enemy in that spot, he could attack them. Speaking of moving, let's see where we have to go by switching the top screen display to the overall map. From here, we can't see as much about Marth, but we can see the conditions for victory in this chapter, which in this game is always to seize. Seizing involves putting Marth onto a specific tile, which is shown by a little yellow box on the map. And if I move our cursor up there, we can see that the space is a throne, just like mentioned in the previous cutscene. The tile you need to seize is almost always a throne, a castle gate, or another significant place like that. One thing the unit menu is good for is quickly jumping to a specific character like I just did. Now let's finally get Marth moving. Once he reaches the space of his movement, a menu opens up. Wait will end his turn without doing anything in particular, and Items lets me review his items. But besides switching between the two of them, or permanently throwing one away if I was an idiot, there's nothing important to do here either, so let's just have him wait. Keep in mind that Marth is like 14, 15, something around those lines in this prologue chapter, so being faced with multiple armed soldiers in this hallway and then demanding that they put down your sword, he's got brass balls to be able to just be like, no, I'm not going to, and then fight them. Anyway, here's where things get interesting. If we look at the objectives, we can see that 4 enemies have entered the map where there weren't any before. Enemies will always have a red color scheme to differentiate them from your army, which is represented by blue. If we try to move Marth, we can see that he can't step onto a tile that an enemy is occupying, but he can attack the enemy if he's standing in any adjacent space. So, as long as he's next to them. Fire Emblem is a turn-based, very deliberate game, so when faced with an opponent, there's no reason to rush. As a rule, you should always take it slow and size up your opponent. Because there's an enemy here, the menu includes attack this time, once he reaches the space of the end of his movement. If I select it, then select a weapon for Marth to attack with, we see what's called the combat window. Marth's stats are on the left, in that dark blue color, and the enemies are on the right. Here's where some of those combat stats come into play. HP, or hit points, or health, or whatever you want to call it, shows how much damage a unit can take before dying. The goal of an individual round of combat is to reduce your enemy's HP as much as possible while minimizing the HP you lose, and trying to avoid your characters hitting 0 for any reason, because in Fire Emblem, once somebody dies, they're dead for good. It's hard to see under the big ×2, but the stat below HP is damage. This shows how many HP the attack will take off the enemy, assuming it hits. Normally in each round of combat, the initiator of the combat will hit first, and the target will get a chance to hit back after that. Because of Marth's stats, he actually gets to attack twice against this enemy, so Marth will get 1 hit, the enemy will get 1, and Marth will get a second hit before the round is over. Hit is accuracy. It's a percentage of likelihood each attack is to hit. 100% is a guaranteed hit, 0% is a guaranteed miss, anything in between is up to a probability. Now, these numbers aren't actually exactly accurate because the formula for hits in most of the newer games uses a system called true hit. To put it simply, if the displayed accuracy is above 50, the attack actually has a slightly higher chance to hit than it says it does, and if it's below 50, it has a slightly lower chance to hit than it says it does. This was implemented to line up more with how people think probabilities work, and it leads to a situation where anything above 80 will very rarely miss, and anything below 50 is pretty unlikely to hit. But it can definitely still happen, and I'd be very surprised if it didn't. Finally, we have crit. This is another percentage-based stat, but this one shows how likely each side is to get a critical hit, which deals triple damage. So each time Marth attacks, he has an 11% chance to get a critical, which would deal 21 damage to this guy with just one hit. It's important to know that once you've reached this stage in combat, pressing A one more time will initiate the fight, so you can back out at any point before that. If I want to switch to a different weapon, and size up how that will change the outcome of the fight, I can do that. Or I can cancel out everything and go back to before Marth even moved if I decide it's a bad idea to attack him. Now let's discuss how the game calculated some of the numbers in the combat window. HP is simple. It's a fixed value specific to each character. Right under Marth's name, you can see that he's at his maximum of 18 of 18 HP right now, and if I mouse over the enemy fighter, he has 14. The amount of damage you deal is based on your attack value, or the ATK, up in the top right there. Attack is a combination of a character's strength stat, visible on the left, as well as the power of the weapon they're using. If we check Marth's items, the stats are displayed at the bottom of the bottom screen, which is the right screen from your perspective. We're looking for might, or MT. For the rapier it's 5, and same for the iron sword. So a 5 might weapon plus Marth's 5 strength gives us a total of 10 attack. But we were only dealing 7 damage with each hit to the fighter. That's because if we look at his stat page, he has 3 defense. Defense reduces incoming damage from physical weapons like swords, axes, and such. So Marth's 10 attack was reduced by the fighter's 3 defense down to 7 damage. Likewise, the fighter has 9 attack from his 7 might iron axe plus his 2 strength, and that 9 is reduced by Marth's 7 defense down to 2 damage, so he'll only take 2 HP off of Marth if he lands a hit with his axe. Now for why Marth hits twice. See the speed stat on the left? Speed usually factors into the calculation for how likely you are to dodge an incoming attack, but if your speed is higher than the enemy by a certain margin, it also allows you to hit them twice in one round of combat, and that happens whether you initiate the combat or if they do. In this game, the margin for doubling is 4 points of speed. Marth has 7 speed, and the fighter has 3 speed, so it seems like Marth has just enough. That's not exactly the case, but I won't get into that right now because it's not super relevant. The last thing to worry about in the combat window are the little up and down arrows next to each character's weapon. Marth's sword has an up arrow, and the enemy's axe has a down arrow. This is because of a system called the weapon triangle. The 3 main weapon types in the game, swords, axes, and lances, have a hierarchy similar to rock, paper, scissors, where swords perform worse when used against lance wielders, lances are worse against axe wielders, and axes are worse against sword wielders. The type of weapon a character can use is decided by their class, and you can see that by a letter next to the icon for that weapon in a character's stats. As a lord, Marth can only use swords, which he has a D rank in. All the other weapons have a dash, showing that he can't use them at all. The enemies are fighters, a class that can only use axes, which they both have an E rank in. Don't worry what the letters mean just yet, just remember that as long as a character has a letter, they can use that type of weapon. Swords beat axes, so Marth has the weapon triangle advantage, which causes his attacks to be more likely to hit, and the enemy's attacks to be less likely to hit. That's already included in the calculations in the combat window. You might be wondering why it matters to know all this stuff if the game calculates it for you, and that's a fair point. But being able to figure out the numbers yourself can help if, for example, you need to get within an enemy's range without attacking them. You can't see the combat window, so you won't know exactly how much you'll hurt them, or they you, unless you do the calculations yourself. And in some cases that can really be the difference between life and death. Speaking of enemy range, you can press the X button to see everywhere that all the enemies can reach with their attacks. Or just select a specific enemy with A to see only their range. Or you can do both, so for example, this is this enemy's range, this is the range of all the enemies, and now it's back to just this guy's again. You can also count out the range yourself the same way as Marth's by counting their movement. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Their range stops here at Marth because he's blocking the one tile hallway here. Enemies cannot pass through spaces occupied by your units, and you can't do it to them either. Marth can get to spaces like this, but only because he has enough movement to actually walk around the enemy to get behind him. Okay, now let's actually take some action against these fighters. From the combat window, I know that Marth is guaranteed to hit twice for 7 damage each for a total of 14 damage against this fighter, which will kill him because Marth has no chance of missing. In return, the fighter will only deal 2 damage to Marth, and that's if he hits, where he only has a 66% chance to begin with. So this is a very safe attack. If I back up and check the other fighter, all the numbers are exactly the same. These enemies both have the exact same stats, so logically the outcome will be the same when I fight them. But I'm not actually going to attack either of them, and I'm just going to have Marth wait here. Why? Because once I end my turn and the enemy gets their turn, both of these fighters will move to attack Marth. Since I already know that he kills both of them in one round of combat, there's no particular reason to attack on my own when I know they're going to die anyway. But before I end my turn, I'm going to go to Marth's items and equip the Iron Sword instead of the Rapier. The weapon you have equipped, which has a little white E on it, is the first one in your list, and that's the one you'll use if you get attacked during the enemy's turn. The stats are the same against these fighters, except for the fact that the Rapier has a built-in 10 crit, raising Marth's chance to get a critical from 1% to 11%. But that's still a very low chance, and I'm gonna kill them anyway, so it's kind of a waste. Weapons have limited uses in this game, shown by the numbers to the right. Once that hits 0, the weapon is gone forever. The Rapier has much fewer uses than the Iron Sword to begin with. There's very few Rapiers in the entire game, and the Rapier has a special ability that isn't useful now, but I want to conserve uses of it for later. So that enemy phase went exactly how I expected it to. Both fighters died, Marth took 4 damage, and he gained 60 experience points, or EXP, for getting kills. Experience only matters when you hit 100, so let's try to do that. And I can't quite reach this next soldier, so let's check his stats to see how we actually match up against him. He's a soldier, which is a class that uses lances, so this is already a bit more dangerous since Marth will be fighting at a weapon triangle disadvantage. But his attack is 10, so Marth still only takes 3 damage if he gets hit, which isn't bad at all. Plus, it's not like we have much of a choice since Marth is our only unit, so let's charge. Sometimes enemies will change their position once your characters cross a certain point on the map, like that soldier just did by moving onto the throne now that Marth got close enough. We'll deal with him in a second, but you can see that Marth didn't quite finish off this soldier, and only got 10 experience rather than the 30 he got from killing the fighters. You always get less experience for hitting but not killing, but once we attack and kill, we'll still get the 30. And I am going to initiate the combat this time, because if I let him live until the enemy phase, he'll attack first and potentially hurt Marth again. In this case, hitting first does actually matter for the purpose of conserving hit points. As you saw, Marth passed 100 experience and he leveled up. Let's take a look at this screen because leveling up is a little complicated. These are all of Marth's main stats, like his strength, speed, defense, etc. Every time a character levels up, they have a percentage chance to gain 1 point in each of their stats, but the percentages are different for every character. These are commonly called growth rates, or just growths, and they're pretty important for determining a character's identity and how good they are. For each new character we get, I'm going to put their chances of growing in each stat up in the bottom of the video and leave it there for a while. I won't comment on every stat individually because that would take forever, but in this case I'll go over it. Marth has an 80% chance to level his maximum hit points, a 50% chance to level his speed, a 0% chance to level his magic, so it'll never happen, 40% skill, and so on and so forth. If I got really lucky, Marth could have gotten a point in every single stat except for magic, or if I was unlucky, he might not have leveled anything at all. As it is, he got HP, strength, and luck, which isn't very surprising since they're some of his highest growths. Overall, that was an average level up, but not one I'm going to complain about. Since we're talking about stats, let me quickly run through the ones we haven't touched yet. We already talked about HP, strength, speed, and defense. Magic is similar to strength in that it determines the attack calculation, but with magic weapons instead of physical weapons. Marth will never level his magic because he has a 0% growth, but that's fine because almost all of the weapons he can use in the game are physical and will only take his strength into account. Skill determines the accuracy and critical chance. The higher it is, the less you'll miss and the more your chance of a critical hit is. Luck affects your chance to dodge, like speed, and your chance to get a critical, like skill, but it affects both to a lesser extent than those stats do. Arguably the most important part of luck is that it lowers your enemy's chance to get a critical hit against you. It really sucks to get hit for triple damage when you weren't expecting it, so having low luck can be really scary. And finally, resistance, or res, is the same as defense, but it reduces damage from magic weapons rather than physical weapons. In general, very few characters have any resistance growth to speak of, which makes magic pretty scary in this game. Alright, now let's finish off this last soldier. He's on a throne, which is our C's objective, but there's more to it than that. If you look at the bottom right of his stat page, you can see the word throne and some numbers. That's the terrain indicator, and it shows the type of tile that the cursor is currently on. So everything else around the soldier is a floor, which is a basic tile with no effects. This is a floor, these stairs are floors, these flaming torch things are floors. This is a wall, which, can't pass through walls. Out here is a river, which is water. And finally, we have the throne. The numbers show that the throne gives whoever's standing on it 2 points of defense, a 20% higher chance to avoid attacks, and heals them for 20% of their maximum HP at the beginning of each of their turns. So the terrain is giving this soldier a decent number of advantages that the other enemies didn't have. But even with that, Marth's stats are so much better than his that the odds are still heavily in our favor here. We'll kill him in 2 rounds at most, assuming we don't miss any of these hits. You also might have noticed that he didn't move towards us. That's because he's considered the boss for this chapter. Bosses usually stay on the tile that they're occupying at the beginning. It's not always reflected in their movement range. Usually they'll have a movement range that's the same as other enemies, so it's kind of tricky to figure out. The game doesn't exactly tell you in any terms whether or not they'll move. You just kind of have to experiment for yourself. It can be pretty scary to get within range of an enemy, and then it's a relief when they don't move. Okay, so he got a little bit of health back at the beginning of his turn, and that was from the throne. Wasn't enough to save him though. And now that he's gone, we can move Marth on top of the throne and select C's to complete this chapter. We killed all the enemies here because we kind of didn't have a choice, but keep in mind that eradicating the enemy is not the objective of each chapter. Seizing with Marth is. Most of the time there's no reason to not wipe out the entire army for the experience points to level up your units, but in some cases it's safer to just claim victory without risking prolonging the battle. And this is the first step in Marth's journey. I apologize if there was an overabundance of explanation, but that's part of what I want to do with this playthrough, to thoroughly explain as much of the game as possible so people who have never played know what's going on, and to help them out if they decide to get into the actual games themselves. More lessons to come in the next episode. Enjoy this last cutscene.